We are continuing our series, I Know I Am, but What Are You? And we're walking through all the things Jesus says about himself. All the things he claims about who he is. And this is important. So oftentimes, you can spend a lot of time in church and really miss the nature of who God says he is and what his claims are to himself. And we get in these conversations about who God is, but we really don't even understand fully what he claims about himself. And as we learn more and more about what Jesus says about himself, the next step is for us to look and say, okay, if that's what Jesus says about himself, then what does that mean for me? What does that mean for me who claims to know him, believe him, and want to follow him, right? Last week, we talked about him declaring himself as the bread of life. Now, today, he talks about himself, he says, I am the light of the world. There's some overlap that you're going to see between the similar themes of what he was saying last week and this week and even in some of the weeks to follow. But there's also distinctive differences between what he says he is and how it tells us a little bit more about who God is when he says, I am the light of the world. Before I get started, though, I want to warn you. Today, I'm going to be using a lot of metaphors. And some of you might love that. Some of you might hate that. What my challenge to you is, I want you to read into it and apply it to yourself. Where do I fit in this? How does this apply to my life now? So there's not going to be necessarily a bunch of direct points towards you. You're going to kind of interpret as we share through some stories here. One of those stories is actually a real story, but it became an allegory or a metaphor for life. When I was becoming a Christian, I've shared with you bits and pieces over the last year of my testimony. I don't think I've ever shared the whole thing, but I'm not going to get into most of it. But what I have shared with you is that I had gone through this phase of a few years of agnosticism, of doubting God. I had reached this pinnacle of that where I remember sitting before God and going, I'm done. This is my last call out. This is my ultimatum. I'm in tears. And even though I doubted God, I knew what I was suggesting was a big deal, to either walk away or walk towards him. Okay? And so I'm highly emotional. And what happened is, I'm not going to get into it, but that week, starting the night I broke down crying, saying, this is the last time I'm talking to you, I saw miracles. Things I've never seen before, things that blew my mind, and even as the greatest skeptic, I had to go, something weird is going on. And all week, that same week, he showed me miracle, 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 and he was trying to grab my attention, trying to reel me back. So I was so caught up in this and so emotional. I was a college student, so I was highly emotional. And I started just driving. And one night I'm driving, and I just felt strongly this leading to go to this mountain that I heard about that was near the school I was at. So I drive to this mountain. I'm in Los Angeles area. I drive to this mountain. And again, I'm emotional and not rational because I'm a college student. So I go to this mountain and I start to go towards it, and I feel like I'm supposed to go to the top and commune and speak and hear from God. But I don't have a flashlight. And it's the middle of the night. And I'm about to walk this path up this mountain. And this path follows along the edge and has a cliff on the side of it. So I do it. And I start walking up it. And I get to this piece of the path where the trees have so overgrown the path that I can no longer see. The only light I have is the moonlight. And I could no longer see how to walk this path. So I'm scared. It's pitch black over this section. And I'm walking with a cliff on the side of me. And I couldn't get through. I got scared. The normal, rational thing would be to turn back and stop. And I felt like God has told me, go up there. So here's what I did. I saw that there were little pieces of moonlight coming through little pieces of the trees that weren't covered. And I looked for those little pieces of moonlight along the path, and I just inched along, trying to find those little pieces of light to find my way through this really dark path. I'll get to the metaphors later if you're not reading into them already. I went up the path. I got through that section. I went up the path by the moonlight again, and all of a sudden I get to this point higher up towards the top of the mountain where all the trees are not around me, and I look out and I can see the city of LA. And I'm seeing millions of lights. And I'm seeing lots of people. And as I'm seeing all these glistening, glimmering lights, my left foot slips off the edge of the path, right on the side of the cliff. And I caught myself, luckily. or else I would not be here today. And I realized, man, I got distracted from all these bright, shining lights. And I kept my eyes off the path, and I no longer was walking on it. I became a danger to myself. And then I got to the top. And this was the greatest revelation that changed, that God changed in my mind. I got to the top, and again, and I'm making jokes, but as a college student, there is this youthful narcissism in which everything revolves around you. I'm in this place in LA in which I'm highly emotional, but I'm also wanting to be a movie director of sorts or some type of thing in film. That's what I'm doing down there. And I have this idea that I'm going to do something successful and great and hopes. And so I'm really into myself. And I look over the city, and I see these thousands of lights, and then I see these little tiny cars driving on the freeways in LA, just thousands of cars. And at that moment, I had this stark revelation of how unimportant I was. I'm looking out going, look how huge this world is. I'm nothing. I'm a mist. I'm a vapor. I'm absolutely unimportant in this world. I'm just one little speck on the map of this world. And then I looked up and I saw thousands of lights in the sky and the stars. And again, now I realize in the scheme of the universe, I'm really just nothing. I'm here today and gone tomorrow. And so it started to shift my perspectives of who I was. But then the same thing, what happened next is I heard a still small voice, which reminded me that when I cried out to God and said, I need to see you, I've never seen you, I'm done, He showed up. And he made it known that I am important to God. He showed up. He listened to me. He wanted me. He drew me in. So in that moment, I had a revelation that was so important that was about how little I was, but in the scheme of God, how big and how loving and how awesome He is. I'm going to come back to that as we go through this. We're going to start in John chapter 8, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. He actually says it twice. He says it in chapter 9. He says it in chapter 8 as well. But there's some context. When we look at what does He mean when He says, I am the light of the world, there's some context that comes with this that we have to understand. See, when He is saying this in chapter 8, He's saying it while He's in front of a temple, it tells us. And He's saying it during what's called the Feast of the Tabernacles. Okay, it's a celebration that they did all the time. And what they would do, this Feast of the Tabernacles, here's what they would do. They'd build little huts. And the whole purpose of this feast was to commemorate and remember what God had done in the wilderness when Israel was wandering aimlessly through the dark and hot and humid wilderness, that God directed them, guided them, fed them, gave them water. That's what this Feast of the Tabernacles is about, okay? So this is what they're celebrating. They're living in huts to remind them when they had no homes and God provided. They dump out water to remind themselves when they were thirsty and God gave them drink from a rock. And then what they did is they lit these large candelabras on the temple. They were so bright that they would light the whole city. And so it tells us in John chapter 7 and 8 that Jesus is standing in front of the place of this temple where those candelabras are. And the candelabras were to remind them of the pillar of fire that God had used to guide them through the desert, if you know the story of Exodus. That there was a pillar of fire. It was the presence of God. And it guided them. When it was dark, it guided them and protected them and led them in this place of darkness where they didn't know where they were going. And that's what these candelabras were supposed to mean. So Jesus is standing in front of these things saying, I'm that light. I am the light of the world. What the light was in the wilderness for Israel, that is me. He's making a radical claim. The presence of God that led you through the most arid and dry season of your life, that is me. So naturally, people get offended again, just like they did with the bread of life. Jesus is standing in the place of the temple saying, this is who I am. In John 8:12, He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is like last week, where He upset all these Jews, these religious folk, and they essentially say to Him over and over again, in one way or another, they say, we don't even know who you are. We don't even know where you came from. Who do you think you are to claim such things? And so, not long after this, Jesus then comes upon the blind man, which Josiah read for us. And he heals the blind man. And he says, I am the light of the world again. See, Jesus' example of being the light of God, like in the wilderness, tells us much of what we need to know about who he is and what he represents. See, the world for us is the wilderness. It's a place of confusion. It's a place of darkness. It's a place of exhaustion. It's that path that I'm walking on that's pitch black, and you're just bumping into things as you go. So let's look at what the statement means about the nature of Jesus when he says, I am the light of the world. First off, this teaches us that Jesus is the guiding light. It's like in the wilderness. If we follow him, we can make it through the deserts of our lives as he illuminates the path through the darkness. He is leading us continually towards the promised land. He's leading us continually towards something much greater than we have ever imagined, something greater than we've ever seen, something we cannot fathom. He is leading us there, but first we've got to walk through these dark paths. John 1 says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That is like my story, where you get to the trek, and it's so black, and it's so dark. And maybe some of you are in that point in your life, you're like, I don't know where I'm going. I can't see. Every angle looks like a danger to me. And what you have to do in those moments is you have to look and say, where are the little pieces of light that I can latch onto? Has anybody been there? Feeling so dark, so lost, what you have to do is say, where are the little pieces of Jesus, the little pieces of the light that I can step on to just keep me on the path? Jesus is the guiding light. Here's what I want you to do. When I was thinking about this, it reminded me of Plato's Republic. He has the allegory of the cave. You guys know that? Okay, I'll remind you, but I knew you would know, Melissa. I mean, I had a clue. Plato has this allegory of the cave. And here's what I want you to do. This is important because I'm going to be using this through the sermon. And I want you to imagine yourself in the situation that I'm describing, okay? So close your eyes if you want to, don't. But I want you to picture yourself in a cave, okay? And this is where you were born, and this is where you've lived your whole life, is in this cave. And you're chained as a prisoner in this cave to other prisoners, okay? And the only thing you've ever known is facing forward to a wall. And behind that wall, there is a fire that is burning. You can't see the fire, but you see its light. And then there are people, almost like puppeteers, that have put figures and shadows on the wall in front of you. And all you have ever known is staring at these shadows and staring at this wall. And that's the world as you know it. You have no concept of anything else. Okay? And then here's the thing, what happens. What I want you to picture is if you're sitting there, tied up in prison for your whole life, and then your shackles all of a sudden become loose and you become free. And you break away and you're able to stand up and look around this cave. And as you're looking around, you look up and you see this light coming from beyond. You see this little light, not from the fire. You see a different light coming from beyond, coming from above you. And you realize that there's something entering into this cave that is beyond what you know. Something that you've never seen before. And all you've known this whole time, and all these prisoners have known, are these shadows and light dancing on the wall. This is like when the Pharisees and the Jews were offended by Jesus, saying that he was the light of the world. Jesus tells them, and they also concur, that you don't know where I come from. You don't know anything about the kingdom that I come from. You don't know anything about the Father who has sent me. You don't know anything about where I reside. Just like you're in the cave, you don't know where this light is coming from. You've known nothing like it before. In the same way, you as a prisoner would have no concept of the world that this light originates from. Just like the Israelites in the wilderness, just like me on the mountain, just like the prisoner in the cave, you don't know where you are going. But if you follow that guiding light through the darkness, you will discover a world, you'll discover truths that you've never known. Jesus says in John 12, I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. No one who believes in me should stay in darkness. Jesus, friends, is the guiding light. He is that light. In another section, we come to find out that while the light guides some, for many, God is a blinding light. He is disorienting to those accustomed to the dark. You know what I mean when you've been in the dark so long and all of a sudden somebody flips on the lights? What do? You start screaming, covering your eyes, right? In chapter 9, as Josiah read, Jesus gives sight to this blind man who's been blind his whole life since birth. And then he's confronted by those who don't believe what has happened. And he says in verse 39, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. The blind who have never seen will now begin to see, but those who think they've been seeing clearly, they will actually become blind." He is a blinding light for some. It's those who think they see clearly. It's those who think that this is all there is. It's those who are stuck in their view of the world and how they want to do things. Those are the ones blinded by God's light. They're hurt by it. They're offended by it. It's just like the Pharisees. "I am finding this highly offensive. I can see nothing of what you're saying." They run from it. It's like when I got up my path and I got to that section of the city that I'm looking at, and I almost fell off the path that God was guiding me on. Because I got distracted by the world. I kept looking at the concerns of the world. I kept looking at the beautiful lights in front of me. Not all that shimmers is gold. And I fell, and I literally almost slipped off this path to my own danger. Because I got I got blinded by the brightness of the city. And not kept my eyes on where God was leading me. The same thing happens in the allegory of the cave. In Plato's example, Plato doesn't talk about God, so I'm taking some liberties here, so if you don't know it, he doesn't talk about God. But I think it's a great example. The prisoner follows this light, and he gets to the top, and he realizes that he can get out. So he follows this light all the way to the top of the cave. He gets out, and he gets out to the world as we know it, with lakes and trees and beauty and sunlight. Okay? But once he gets out, he's never seen light like this, and it just blinds him. It's disorienting. He can't see anything. So what does he do? He goes back. He goes back into the cave because it was scary, because it seemed dangerous, because it seemed harmful. So he got blinded by this new light, and he goes back to the cave. See, once you step into the world, you're exposed to the sun. And when you've spent your whole life in darkness, you can no longer see. Even though the sun gives life, it's still blinding for some. So you run back into the cave. In John 3:19, Jesus says, "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed." Have you guys ever seen that in your life? Have you ever seen that in the life of others? That's easier for us, right? I've seen other people like that. Okay? I challenge you to try to see if it might be in you, maybe. But you get something just directly confronts something you've been hiding, something you've been thinking, something you've been feeling, and it starts to reveal some stuff in your life. And so you shut it off, or you get angry, or you run away, or you shut God off because it's starting to show you things you didn't want to see. See, when we enter into the world, something that shines our light on our desires, on our thoughts, our practices, we have two choices. See, some of us can be like Paul on the road to Damascus. He encounters God for the first time, Jesus in his bright light, and he falls on his face, groveling before God. However, others will get angry at the light. They will run from it. They'll deny the truth. They will hide their face. It's kind of like if you're staring at a mirror. Anybody got those body mirrors in your room? I'll say Michelle bought it, but I like it too. It's not bad. But you can see the whole outfit and stuff. But sometimes, in your own bedroom, you're kind of looking at how's my body look, right? but I put the lights really low and I feel pretty good about it. I don't even have to go to the gym. I just got to turn the lights a little lower. And you feel good. And you're like, wow, that's not too shabby. But then your spouse comes in and flips on the light. And you're like, oh! And all of a sudden, you see every fold. You see every mole. You see every stretch mark. Now you have two options. You can say, turn off that light again, I want to look good. Or you can say, man, maybe I got some work to do. Maybe I've got to confront the truth here, or I need to turn off the lights. 1 John 1, it says, God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and we do not live out the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, purifies us from all sin. See, for many, Christ is a blinding light. His word confronts the truths of the things we don't want to accept. We are blinded to his leading. We fall off the path and into the dark. Lastly, Jesus is the revealing light. He unveils God's truth about ourselves, about our world. He reveals truths about his kingdom that is to come. When we go after him, we begin to see more and more about our own hearts, about our own minds, about our world around us. We see truths that we couldn't see otherwise. See, as we saw, Jesus heals the blind man, and the blind man essentially says, I don't know who this guy is exactly, but one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. He's saying, I don't know fully who Jesus is yet, but I do know the fact that I've seen what he does. I've seen that there's something greater going on here because I was blind, and I know that for sure. And then as you guys laughed, it's a great line. He says, do you want to be his disciples too? Because they keep asking questions because they don't get it. And so he tells the Pharisees, he says, this is remarkable. You don't know where he came from. You guys see, and you don't know where he came from, yet he opened my eyes. Isn't it obvious? Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. And if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. If this man were not from God, I know where he comes from because I've seen who he is, and nobody does this stuff. How come you who are religious, how come you who read the scriptures, how come you who know Moses don't understand who he's pointing to? How come you don't understand where he comes from? Because you see. You think you see. See, here was this guy who was considered a sinner because of his blindness. He was blind all his life. And he's speaking to those in power. He's speaking to Pharisees. And he is telling these studious, religious people that it is remarkable that they can't see clearly. His life testifies to the power of Jesus, even if he doesn't understand it fully. See, when God shows you his light, when you allow your eyes to adjust, when you allow him to show you more and more truths as you walk alongside of him, you begin to see truths of this new world beyond what you have ever seen or imagined. You realize that there are greater things at work than what you've been watching on the wall in front of you for your whole life. This is kind of like when I reached the top of the mountain and I look out and my whole life has been about Nick Jones. It is. Your whole life is like you, and you stand up and you look out over the city and realize, I could die right here, right now, and nobody would care. Maybe just my parents. Maybe my brother. But they'd move on because life goes on, and it is big, and it is vast. I'm nothing in the midst of this. And yet at the same time, you look up and you realize that God has intervened in your life. Not only has he died for you and you all, but he intervenes in your life if you're willing to see the many ways that you could have fallen off the cliff, and he intervenes. And you know that to God, you matter greatly. You matter so much because he is faithful and he has this great purpose for you. And there is something much greater than you've ever seen that will give you purpose and fulfillment. And you begin to see that when he reveals these things to you. As you go after him, as you keep on his path, as you stare at his light, It's kind of like the allegory of the cave. This scenario, though, instead of the prisoner breaking out into the real world, breaking out where there's sun and seeing flowers and lakes and beauty and running away because he's blind, he waits. He walks a little further. He follows the light a little more. And what happens as he's up there longer? As he goes deeper and deeper into this world, his eyes begin to adjust, right? Like when your eyes, when you're blinded when somebody flips on the lights, right? Your eyes begin to adjust, and slowly you begin to make out some shapes. And then you begin to see flowers, and then you begin to see trees, and then you begin to see the lakes, and then you begin to see the sky, and eventually, as your eyes adjust more and more to the truth, to the light, you can actually see the source of it, the sun. You can stare at it. And you can see where it's emanating from. You're seeing more and more truth the deeper and longer you go. And see, for many of us, and many of you in this room, you've come to a place in your faith where you just stopped and said, I don't want to go much further because it's getting too bright in here. There's some stuff I don't want to deal with. There's some things I don't want to do. There's some things I think he says that I don't want to read. I don't want to go any further. It's too bright. It's revealing too much in me. See, when you have truly seen the beauty of this new life and the freedom and the world you've never known, then who would say, I want to go back and live in the cave again? You would never want to leave, right? How many of you would want to go back and live in the cave once you've adjusted to seeing the beauty of this other world? Oftentimes, when we think about getting close to God, getting closer and closer to Him, we think, well, that means I'll be more moral. That means I'll feel more spiritual. That means I'll feel better. That means I'll feel like I'm a greater person. Is that it? Just wrestle with that. You don't have to tell me. If you want to, you can. Isn't that what you think sometimes? If I'm getting closer to God, then I'll be upstanding. I got to tell you, it's the opposite. The closer you get to God, the more He reveals, the deeper it penetrates. The closer you get to God, like on the mountain, the more you see your sin, the more you see your brokenness, the more you see your emptiness, the more His light shines on you. It starts revealing every thought, every crevice, every piece of your heart and your mind that has been hidden, that you've been hiding and not wanting to talk about. Those pieces of you that you hate. The closer you get to God, you don't feel more awesome. You realize how much more you need Him. It's kind of like in Exodus 34, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, if you know the story. This is important to know this if you don't know Exodus, because Jesus is referring to it a lot. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and when he returns, it says that he was in the presence of God, and his face was glowing. That his face was radiant, and that the others around him drew back in fear. Because the way he would present himself, it just revealed so much. He was so radiant. They wouldn't come near him. So what they did is they put a veil over Moses' face so that he wouldn't scare the life out of them. See, when you draw close to God, it doesn't make you feel like you've arrived. It reveals all the ways you haven't. It makes you draw back. And it's just like that in the mirror example I gave you. If I'm looking at myself in the dark and I feel like, wow, I'm pretty fine. And then my wife flips on the lights and I begin to see that I'm not that good looking. I'm a little fatter than I thought I am. I got a little more going on than I thought. And it reveals things I don't like about myself. But you know what it does at the exact same time? I realize how much she must love me. Because I'm not as good as I thought I was, and yet she loves me immensely. And so at the same time that I realize that I am more faulty than I thought, I realize she loves me a ton because she wants me, she desires me, she wants to be with me, and it doesn't matter. She's seen all that. I'm just seeing it for the first time, just like God. He's seen all your stuff. He's seen all the things you've been turning the lights off on. He's seen your nakedness, your ugliness, your fat, your folds. And yet He's coming down and saying, I'm dying for you. I'm present with you. I'm sending my Spirit to be with you. I want to be near you. That is the revelation. He is the revealing light, and those things happen together. You don't just feel bad and ugly. You feel, you come to realize the things that are not good about you, but you realize how immensely you're loved, and that makes that love even greater. Do you understand? See, if I think I've earned my wife's love because I work out all the time, then she's lucky. Right? But when I realize she loves me no matter what, I'm lucky. And that's my relationship to God. See, when you think you've earned your way to God, you feel like, hey, I'm doing a good work. I deserve this. But when you realize, when you allow His light to shine into every piece of your life, you go, wow, He loves me more than I could even imagine. And it becomes real for you. So here's an important side point that I think it's not exactly in line with the sermon, but I think it's important as I read this. In chapter 7, 8, and 9 of John, I realized that there is a different pattern to how we often think about things. Maybe it's just me. But oftentimes we think, when I understand the truth better, when I get better and more moral, when I get better feeling, then I can draw closer to God, then I can pursue Him more. When I can see, when He can prove to me that He exists, then I can pursue Him more. But when I read the words of Jesus in chapter 7, 8, and 9, I realize that there's a different pattern here. He says, before you see clearly, before you can see all the truths, before you know everything that you need to know about God and your walk with Him, first follow. You don't need to know. You can still be in the cave blind. Just follow. Just follow a bit of the light. And as you follow it, then as you follow, you continue to increasingly receive revelation. You continue to see more and more that you never saw before over time. And the further you draw closer to God and nearer to God, more often than the more revelation. And then your worldview, your mind, everything completely changes. Follow first. I don't know why I'm going up this mountain. I don't know why I'm climbing out of this cave, but I'm following this little piece of light. And as I go, I learn more and more along the way, not knowing what the end goal is. And see, so some of you are waiting for yourself to get just right, for you to have full understanding before you really jump in. He's saying, just follow me. I'll reveal it as we go. Don't wait. So those are the many things that Jesus teaches us about Himself. So the ending question then, in light of who Jesus is, who are you? According to Jesus in Matthew 5, you are the light of the world, church. He says people don't light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine, church, before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. See, Jesus says He is the light of the world, and then He says you are the light of the world. You confused yet? See, you are like Moses. Here's why He says it. You are like Moses. When you have really drawn close to the presence of God, when you have followed the light closely, when you have walked out of darkness into the light and been in His presence more and more, it begins to penetrate every part of you and you radiate. You reflect God. You reflect His light to the world. It's like having the worst and brightest sunburn you've ever had. Anybody been there? When you're white, it really shows, okay? And so you go out and you just get bleach red, right? What do people know? A, that you're dumb that you didn't put suntan lotion on. But they know that you've been in the presence of the sun for a long time. Right? Hey. They know, right? That you've been exposed. You radiate that sun. See, Moses had to veil his face because he emanated God's glorious light, and it caused others to draw back. But 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says, whenever someone turns to the Lord, that veil is taken away. For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So all of us who have had that veil removed can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. See, oftentimes I hear people say, I don't feel close to God. I get it. I understand. But perhaps it's because you don't want to draw near to him. Perhaps you're wearing a veil because you're afraid what you might find and what you might hear and what you might be called to if you begin to let him penetrate your life more. But when that veil is taken away, when you are no longer chained in the cave with other prisoners, and when you follow after the light, there is freedom. The closer you get to the light, the more you begin to reflect it to others. You are the reflecting light, church. Let's look at the allegory of the cave one more time. When you get outside in the world, when you have seen the things that you once never knew, when you see his beauty, when you see the freedom that you now have that you never had before, when you see the greatness of the Creator, what do you want to do? Just stay there? No. When you experience this and you know these people you've lived your whole life with are still in the cave, you want to go back and be with them and tell them, hey, let me show you the light. Let me show you what I've learned. Let me show you what I've seen. I want to go back to the cave and bring my loved ones with me. This is like the blind man. The blind man was not a well-learned person. He was considered a sinner and an outcast in many respects. And the Pharisees are here, these intellectual religious people, and they're doubting him. And it tells us that they're insulting him. And even his own family won't stick up for him. Yet, in spite of all this, he doesn't withdraw back into his blindness. He is resolute in sharing what Jesus has done. And he's resolute in sharing with others. Even these Pharisees saying, you've got to hear what he's done. How can I not tell you? I have seen things I've never seen my whole life. He knows a greater truth and he can't help but testify. He says, I don't know much, but I know this one thing. I was blind, but now I see, and I'm telling everybody about it. When you were completely blind, and now Jesus has shown you things that you have never seen, how do you not share it? You go back to the cave, you go back to the darkness, and you tell others how they can come and see what you've seen as well. It's like going back to him and saying, come with me. Let me tell you what is possible beyond what you think you know. And here's what's going to happen. You should be doing that, not because of some compulsion, not because of some church class that guilted you into evangelism, which we will be offering in the fall. It's actually true. I just had to think about that. But it comes out of a place of, God, I've drawn near and you're showing me things that I have to talk about. I have to talk about it. And here's what will happen if you do that. If you go to people and you share with them all the things, all the crazy stuff that God is doing, some different things, there will be different responses. Some will have become so adjusted to the darkness, and they will think that what you're talking about is so fantastical that it doesn't make sense, it's not rational, and you must be stupid or crazy. And then some will be afraid of what you're suggesting. They'll say, I don't know if I want to do that. And they'll choose to stay put because of fear. And then some may believe you. They may say, okay, I believe in that kingdom that you're talking about. But they're so comfortable with what they know that they don't want to follow. But some will hear and say, show us the way. Show us the way. And your task is to point up to the light in that cave and say, see that light? Follow it and I'll go with you. Follow that light. That is the way. That is the only way. And then, because you have already walked the difficult path out of the cave, you are to go into the darkness, bring others with you, and walk with others through that darkness. See, there are a ton of people in your life right now, and some that need to be, that are living in perpetual darkness. And I'm not talking they're just sinners. I'm talking about going through the heartache and pain of this world. I'm talking about the broken and hurting. I'm talking about those in poverty. I'm talking about those here in Reedley. I'm talking about those in Africa. It doesn't matter. There are people in your own families that are suffering through depression and darkness. Your job is to point to a greater kingdom, but also to walk alongside of them through that. You have to enter back in, and that's not fun sometimes. You have to go back where they're at and walk alongside on the path to them knowing Christ. That's discipleship. That is discipleship. It's continuing to share what you have learned, to teach about the kingdom of God along the way as you go, and how different it is than the world we know. It's to continue to teach about the King himself and how he is faithful and just. It's walking with them through the Scriptures. It's like Psalm 119 says, verse 105. The word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. It's helping them understand that the word of God will continue to direct you and guide you on your path. Friends, even if you don't see clearly yet, even if you don't know what mountain you're climbing and what's at the top, follow. Even if it's dark outside, follow. As you follow, you will go through pains. You will go through needing to adjust to the light, but the closer and the longer you draw near, you will see truths you could have never fathomed. You see your world differently. You'll see yourself differently, and you'll see the beauty and the grace of the Father. It'll change your world. And you are to help others and lead them out of the cave into the light. Are you the blind who now see? Or are you those who claim to see like the Pharisees and are actually blind? You've actually never seen the greatness of our God. If you have truly experienced God's kingdom, then nothing should stop you from seeking to share it with others. Sharing what you've seen, walking alongside of them from the darkness into the light.